On the 4th of May, 2017, firefighters were called out to a quiet stretch of road near the reservoir, just outside Barcelona, after someone spotted a car burning in the darkness. When they finally put the flames out, they found a body curled inside what was left of the trunk, burned so completely that investigators couldn't even use dental records to confirm who it was. They had to trace the vehicle's chassis number just to get a name. That name belonged to a 38-year-old local police officer named Pedro Rodriguez, and the two people who would eventually be convicted of putting him in that trunk weren't strangers, weren't rivals from some other precinct, and weren't criminals he'd crossed paths with on the job. They were his own colleagues. One of them was the woman he lived with. The other was a man he worked alongside every single day, riding in the same patrol car, wearing the same uniform, answering to the same badge number system as the woman they both loved. What happened between these three officers over the years leading up to that night is one of the strangest, most talked about criminal cases to come out of Spain in the last decade. And if you're the kind of person who needs to understand exactly how something like this unravels, piece by piece, you're going to want to stick with this one all the way through. Before we get into today's case, take 2 seconds to help the channel grow. If you enjoy real true crime stories based on verified facts, court records, and official investigations, hit subscribe now so you don't miss our next case. And if you find this video interesting, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps YouTube recommend these videos to more true crime fans. Now, let's get into what happened to Pedro Rodriguez. Rosa Maria Perel Vinuela was born in Badalona, a coastal city just northeast of Barcelona, in October of 1983. She grew up to become an officer with the Guardia Urbana, Barcelona's local municipal police force, the kind of job that comes with a uniform, a badge, and at least on paper, a certain amount of public trust. Somewhere along the way, she married a man named Rubain, who was also a police officer, working with a separate force, the Mossos d'Esquadra, which serves as the regional police of Catalonia. The two of them had children together. On the surface, it looked like a stable life, the kind built by two people who both understood exactly what the other's job demanded of them. But by 2012, while she was still married to Rubain, Rosa had begun an affair with a fellow Guardia Urbana officer named Albert Lopez Ferrer, a man a couple of years older than her, also born in Badalona, back in June of 1981. Albert and Rosa worked together, sometimes literally sharing a patrol car, which meant they spent long stretches of time alone together on shift, away from anyone who might notice how close they'd actually become. That affair didn't stay hidden forever, and eventually, Rosa's marriage to Rubain came apart. Not long after, Rosa entered into a new relationship, this time with Pedro Rodriguez, another officer on the same force. Pedro had previously been married himself, but by the time he and Rosa were together, that marriage had ended. Rosa and Pedro eventually moved in together, and from the outside it looked like she'd found her next chapter. What almost none of Pedro's coworkers realized, at least not at first, was that Rosa hadn't actually ended things with Albert. The affair between the two of them continued quietly, running underneath her relationship with Pedro for years, an arrangement that apparently worked, in some fractured way, for a surprisingly long time. It's worth pausing here to say something that makes this case even messier to untangle. All three of these people, Pedro, Rosa, and Albert, had already found themselves at the center of controversy within the Barcelona police force before any of this violence took place. Pedro had been suspended from duty after he was accused of assaulting a motorcyclist during a stop on the Rabasada Road. Rosa, for her part, had been the reported victim of what's often called revenge porn, after a senior officer allegedly distributed an intimate photograph of her without her consent. That officer was eventually prosecuted, though he was ultimately acquitted by a Barcelona criminal court in January of 2018. And Albert had his own history of complaints filed against him, including involvement in a 2014 arrest in Barcelona's Montjuic neighborhood, during which the man being arrested died, along with a separate conviction connected to an assault on a street vendor. None of these earlier incidents directly caused what would eventually happen to Pedro. But they paint a picture of a workplace already simmering with tension, scandal, and unresolved conflict, long before anyone even knew a murder was coming. At some point, the fragile balance between the three of them broke completely. Albert eventually confronted Pedro directly and admitted to the affair he'd been having with Rosa, a confession that detonated whatever peace had existed among the three of them. From that point forward, the relationships between all three officers grew increasingly turbulent. And yet, somehow, in the middle of all that wreckage, Albert and Rosa found their way back to each other again. According to what would later come out during the investigation, that reconciliation is where the plan to remove Pedro from the picture entirely is believed to have taken shape. The night everything changed was the night of April the 30th into May the 1st, 2017. Earlier that evening, Rosa and Pedro had been at a family dinner together, an ordinary night, the kind of evening that gives absolutely no indication of what's about to happen once everyone gets home. Phone records gathered afterward showed that shortly after Rosa and Pedro returned to the home they shared, Rosa placed a call to Albert. It appears she'd just seen a string of messages from him. Albert called her back not long after, this time from a second phone he'd purchased just 10 days earlier. On the 20th of April, a detail investigators would later treat as significant, since a second phone bought shortly before a killing tends to raise exactly the kind of questions you'd expect it to. What happened inside that home in the hours that followed is where the case becomes genuinely difficult to pin down with total certainty, and it's important to say clearly that some of what took place that night has never been conclusively established, even by the court that eventually convicted both Rosa and Albert. The official finding was that Pedro suffered at least one blow to his skull, delivered at a moment when he was either asleep, dozing, or under the effect of drugs. Investigators and prosecutors worked from the theory that Rosa had drugged Pedro earlier that night, and that Albert then made his way to the home in the early hours of the morning to help carry out the killing itself. Phone data supported the idea that Albert did, in fact, show up at Rosa's house that night, but exactly who struck the fatal blow and the precise sequence of what happened in that room remained something the two of them would spend years arguing about, each insisting the other one did it. What isn't disputed is what happened next. The following day, Rosa and Albert went about the day in a manner that, in hindsight, seems almost impossible to reconcile with what neither of them denied being involved in by that point. They joined coworkers for lunch, behaving, by every account, entirely normally. Then, at some point that same day, they took Pedro's body, still concealed inside the trunk of his own car, and began driving it to locations around the city that Pedro would ordinarily have visited during a typical day, apparently trying to lay down a trail that would suggest he was still alive and simply going about his usual routine. At one point, they drove to the home of Rosa's ex-husband, Rubain, and made a final stop there before continuing on. It later became clear that this stop wasn't random. According to investigators, Rosa and Albert began telling acquaintances that Pedro had gotten into some kind of conflict with Rubain, an apparent attempt to plant the idea, early and deliberately, that if anything had happened to Pedro, her ex-husband was the one who should be looked at first. Eventually, that drive ended near the Foix reservoir, close to the town of Cubells, southwest of Barcelona. There, the car was set alight, with Pedro's body still inside it. It would sit there, unnoticed, until the fire was spotted and reported on the 4th of May. In the days immediately following the murder, more unsettling details began stacking up. Rosa reportedly manipulated Pedro's mobile phone in the days after his death, apparently in an effort to make it look, to anyone checking in on him, like he was still alive and simply not responding for reasons of his own. Investigators later found what they described as blood belonging to Pedro inside the basement of the home Rosa shared with him, a detail that would become one of the more damning pieces of physical evidence against her. They also discovered that a sofa, which had previously been kept in that same basement, had been disposed of at some point after the murder and was never recovered, despite an extensive search. The crime scene itself showed clear signs of having been cleaned. There was also the matter of Rosa's own father, Paco Perel. In the early days of the investigation, he told officers with the Mossos d'Esquadra that he had personally seen Pedro alive on the 2nd of May, a full day after the point at which investigators and the court would eventually determine Pedro had already been killed. Later, after Rosa's arrest, 2 officers testified that Paco Perel privately admitted to them that he had lied about seeing Pedro alive, and that he had done so because his daughter had asked him to. At trial, Paco Perel denied ever saying any such thing to those officers, directly contradicting their sworn testimony. The court ultimately found that his statement, whether it was a lie told out of desperation to protect his daughter or not, hadn't actually shaped the outcome of the case against Rosa, and he was acquitted of the separate charge of covering for her. By the 13th of May, according to Rosa's own later account, she went to investigators herself to offer her version of events, only to be told, in that meeting, that she was going to be arrested. Whether that moment played out exactly as she's described it is something only she and the investigators in that room can really speak to. What's certain is that, on the 14th of May, 2017, both Rosa Perel and Albert Lopez were formally arrested by the Mossos d'Esquadra, the very same regional police force that Rosa's ex-husband still belonged to. A judge ordered both of them held without bail while the investigation continued, and formal charges of murder were prepared against them both. For a while, both Rosa and Albert appeared to be working from the same script, publicly and privately suggesting that Pedro's death was somehow connected to organized crime, or pointing suspicion toward Rosa's ex-husband, the very man they'd driven past on their route to the reservoir. That shared version of events held together for a period of time. But eventually, under the weight of everything investigators had already gathered, phone records, cell tower data placing both of them at the scene, DNA evidence, and the blood found in that basement, the story the two of them had been telling together started to fall apart. And once it did, it didn't just collapse quietly. It turned the two of them against each other completely. Piecing together what actually happened took investigators years, largely because so much of the physical evidence had been deliberately destroyed. A body burned beyond recognition doesn't just make identification difficult. It makes it nearly impossible to say with certainty how someone died, which is exactly why the court was ultimately left describing Pedro's cause of death only in terms of possibility rather than certainty. Instead of relying on the body itself, prosecutors had to rebuild the night of the murder almost entirely from surrounding evidence: the timing of phone calls between Rosa and Albert, the movement of both of their phones as recorded by nearby cell towers, security camera footage picking up the car at various points along its route the following day, and the blood evidence recovered from the basement of the home Rosa had shared with Pedro. It was a case built not around a single smoking gun, but around dozens of smaller data points that, taken together, left the jury with what they described as no reasonable doubt that Rosa and Albert had been involved, even if the exact mechanics of who did what inside that house could never be fully settled. The scale of public attention the case attracted while all of this was being pieced together is hard to overstate. In Spain, there's a word, morbo, that doesn't translate cleanly into English, but roughly describes a kind of morbid fascination, a pull toward the lurid and the scandalous that keeps people watching even when they know they probably shouldn't be quite so interested. This case had morbo in abundance. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Talk shows dedicated entire episodes to picking apart the personal lives of 3 police officers, most of the country had never heard of before a burned car turned up near a reservoir. And at the center of nearly all of it was Rosa, whose romantic history was treated, again and again, less like evidence relevant to a murder investigation and more like a character flaw on public display. A framing that plenty of commentators have since pushed back against as unfair, regardless of what the jury ultimately decided about her guilt. What followed was a nearly 3-year investigation before the case finally reached trial, a jury trial that began on the 3rd of February, 2020, at the Provincial Court of Barcelona. And by the time that trial started, Rosa and Albert weren't standing together anymore, not in any sense. Each one now told a version of events that placed the blame squarely on the other. Rosa's account was that Albert had killed Pedro out of jealousy, and that she had only gone along with everything that happened afterward, the drive, the staging, the burning of the car, because Albert had threatened her, and threatened her children if she didn't cooperate. Albert's account inverted that story entirely. According to him, it was Rosa who killed Pedro, following an argument between the two of them, and it was only afterward that she came to him, asking for his help in disposing of the body, a request he says he agreed to out of love for her, or, in some accounts he's given out of fear of what she was capable of. The prosecution, for its part, wasn't interested in either version being treated as an innocent bystander story. Prosecutors argued that this wasn't a case of one partner acting alone, while the other reluctantly got dragged into the cleanup. They argued that Rosa and Albert had planned Pedro's killing together, with malice aforethought, specifically so the two of them could finally be free to be together without Pedro standing in the way. Prosecutors sought a 20-year sentence for Albert and a 25-year sentence for Rosa, 5 years longer, based on an aggravating factor tied to her close personal relationship with the victim, the fact that Pedro wasn't a stranger to her, but the man she had been living with. The trial itself became something close to a national spectacle in Spain. Details about the personal lives of all 3 officers, the affairs, the overlapping relationships, the messy history between them, spilled out across newspapers and talk shows, often overshadowing the more sober forensic and procedural details that were actually deciding the outcome of the case. Much of that coverage focused disproportionately on Rosa, framing her romantic history in ways that many observers, both during and after the trial, would later argue had less to do with establishing guilt, and more to do with satisfying a very particular kind of public fascination. After weeks of testimony, by the end of March 2020, the jury retired to deliberate. 6 days later, they returned with a verdict. 8 of the 10 jurors found Rosa Perel guilty of murdering Pedro Rodriguez with malice aforethought. 7 of the 10 found Albert Lopez guilty on the same charge. In April of 2020, the court formally sentenced Rosa to 25 years in prison and Albert to 20 years, exactly in line with what prosecutors had asked for. Both were also ordered to pay Pedro's family a combined total of €880,000 in compensation. As of a few years later, records showed that Rosa had paid only a small fraction of that amount, and Albert had paid barely anything at all. Neither Rosa nor Albert accepted the verdict quietly. Both filed appeals, first to the High Court of Justice of Catalonia, and later to Spain's Supreme Court, arguing, among other things, that the evidence hadn't clearly established which of them had actually delivered the fatal blow. Both appeals failed. The High Court of Catalonia upheld the original sentence, and so did the Supreme Court, closing off, at least for now, any further legal path for either of them to overturn their convictions. In the years since the verdict, the case has never really faded from public view in Spain. It's been the subject of a docuseries, several podcasts, and eventually, in 2023, 2 very different Netflix productions, a documentary featuring Rosa's first interview since being sent to prison, and a separate dramatized miniseries depicting the events of the case with actors standing in for the real people involved. Rosa has been openly critical of that dramatized version, saying publicly that she felt it was made with bad intentions and that it caused real harm to her teenage daughters, who had nothing to do with any of it and never asked to have their mother's case turned into entertainment. In her own words, she has continued to maintain that she is innocent and has said that what she regrets most is not going to the police herself on the day she says Albert killed Pedro. Albert's public position on the case has shifted over time in a way that's worth mentioning honestly, without pretending it settles anything for certain. Years after the original trial, in 2024, reporting emerged suggesting that Albert had, in a private setting, admitted to being the one who actually killed Pedro. That reported admission has not reopened the legal case, and it exists alongside Rosa's continued insistence that she is the innocent one, and that Albert bears full responsibility. As with several other details in this case, exactly what was said by whom, and how it should be weighed against years of conflicting testimony remains something reasonable people, including the courts that already ruled on this case, have treated with real caution. What makes this case so difficult to look away from isn't just the murder itself, or the burned car, or the reservoir where it was finally discovered. It's the fact that everyone involved, the victim and both of the people convicted of killing him, wore the same uniform, answered to the same command structure, and had in some form sworn to protect the very public that would eventually spend years consuming every detail of their private lives as entertainment. Pedro Rodriguez went home after a family dinner on an ordinary night in April of 2017, and some